Hello, world. Welcome to Clear the Air, the podcast. This is episode 6, and today we are going to be talking about a very relevant issue in the current media, in the world today, and that is coronavirus. But specifically, we are going to be looking at the environmental side of coronavirus and deciding whether it has had good outcomes, bad outcomes, a little bit of both, what it might mean for our future in relation to climate change, and just all the environmental aspects of COVID-19. Before we get into that, just a few updates. First of all, I want to say I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're all finding ways to manage the stress, manage the calm during this hectic time. For me, it's been almost relaxing in a sense. Not the fact that I'm afraid to go to stores because I might get coronavirus or something like that, but it's been some time to reflect on life, reflect on relationships, get outside. I miss just exploring the wilderness, exploring nature, and I've had a lot of time just to wander around, explore my local natural areas. It's been some time to catch up on sleep, which has been very important and very lacking during the school term. And it's just been a time to rejuvenate and connect with people, even if I can't physically connect, just connecting over social media, over email, over phone or Skype or whatever it is, just seeing how people are doing. So I hope you are doing well and finding some time to relax and take care of yourself, because that's what we need to do. Taking care of yourself is more than just about physically distancing yourself from people. It's about taking care of your mental space as well. An update from the blog. You may have noticed that there's been more frequent posts being put out now that school's kind of not happening or it's happening all online. I've had a lot more time to really focus in and write more content, put out more podcasts, which is exciting. So I encourage you to check those out. Go to ctablog.ca to see the new episodes and the new blog posts there. Also, very exciting for me, at least, I've had some time to revitalize the branding for the blog. So you may have noticed that the logo has changed, the podcast logo has changed, banners and fonts and things like that are changing. I'm really excited with what I've been able to create, especially because I'm still pretty new to photo editing software, at least professional photo editing software. So I'm glad with what the changes are like, and I'm really enjoying it, and I think it gives a more professional look to the blog. So I'm excited for that. And in the future, there will be some more changes or exciting things coming, so make sure you're staying tuned for that. The last thing I want to say before we get into the content for the podcast is that if you are listening on platforms like Apple Podcast, Spotify, please make sure to rate and review the podcast. That is how we get it out to other people, how we get it to a larger audience, so that more people can learn and they can educate and empower themselves and start making change to promote a sustainable future. So all it takes is just honestly 5 seconds or less to give a rating, and if you are feeling very generous, write a short review. It would mean the world to me. So without further ado, let's get into the content for today. So coronavirus, is it good for the environment? That's the question we are seeking to address today. And the answer isn't cookie cutter clear. It's a very complex issue, like any environmental issue, honestly. And there are pros and cons to it. So I've done a little bit of research, as well as just what I've heard on the news in general over the past couple of weeks, and from my own understanding of sustainability and how society functions and how our systems are all connected, I've been able to draw on some conclusions, and I wanted to, in this episode, break down these pros and cons for you, and then at the end just kind of provide a general message that I'm getting from the way society is behaving and related to COVID-19, its impacts on the environment, and what the implications will be for future, for climate change, and for how our society approaches climate change reduction mitigation initiatives. First of all, I would like to focus on the positives, because positivity is good. Positivity is great in this time of stress and anxiety and what seems like a very negative world. So you've probably read it on the news read on the news? Yeah, that makes sense. Read on the news or watched on the news, whatever you are engaging in, what you're getting your content from. You've probably seen that there's been significant greenhouse gas reductions as a result of lockdowns, which prevent travel from happening, which prevent people from going on vacation, with restaurants and businesses closing down. More people are working from home, so they have to commute less. So we've been seeing some pretty dramatic greenhouse gas reductions. In fact, some of these reductions are unprecedented in the sense that no country has been able to achieve such drastic emissions reductions in such a short time frame before. Just to clarify why this is important, greenhouse gases are major contributors to the global warming. They absorb solar radiation as it bounces off the earth and keeps it in the atmosphere, which causes the earth to warm faster. So if we are trying to avoid the 2 degrees benchmark that is set under the Paris Agreement, and if you don't know much about that, I can link to a blog post where I discuss this more in the show notes. But if we want to reach this 2-degree cutoff, then greenhouse gas reductions is essential because those are directly what impacts the warming that the world experiences. So not surprisingly, major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions are these industrial countries, these developed countries. So we're looking at places like China, where so much of the industrialization has happened, a lot of production occurs, most of the world's commodities are coming from China. Then we're also looking at places like Canada, the USA, the UK, the Australia, where we are very developed. We are a very fast-paced, consumerism-driven society. So we're intaking a lot, we're traveling a lot, we're producing a lot of emissions. But we are some of the countries that are experiencing these drastic reductions. So for instance, China, who, as I mentioned, is one of the heaviest polluters due to their industrial activities, has actually seen a 25% emissions reduction compared to normal carbon dioxide levels. And carbon dioxide is one of the main emissions that we are trying to reduce in relation to our reduction targets. And that's insane. Like, I can't even express how much that is. Like, we have never been able to achieve that. Honestly, some countries' goals are to reduce their emissions 20% over 10 to 15 years. So the fact that China, one of the largest emission producers in the world, has reduced that in a matter of a few months is mind-blowing. Also recently, as we know, Italy has been in lockdown, and there are satellite images from the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service that has been examining emissions, specifically nitrous oxides, which are another important emission in our atmosphere that contributes to global warming. So they've been monitoring these emissions from end of January to mid-March, so only about a week or so ago, and they created these really interesting satellite imagery that's available, and I can put the links to those in the show notes. And it shows there has been a 10% reduction in nitrous oxides per week within the past 4 to 5 weeks in Italy. So 10% per week, they're probably, I'm not sure if it's 10% of the previous weeks, so I don't know if it adds up. So like in 4 weeks it would be 40%. I don't know if it's in 1 week 10% and then the following week there's 10% less of what was existing the prior week. But whatever it is, that's a major shift in such a short amount of time. Also, the Bay Area Rapid Transit System in San Francisco has reported transit ridership has decreased 8% between the end of February and the first week of March. And then from the first week of March to the second week of March, they've noticed a 25% drop further. So in total, that's about 33%. So people are just in general traveling less, and traveling is one of the major sources of emissions. That said, with less people using public transit, there is kind of a dual meaning to that. We're not entirely sure if it's because people are staying home more, which is called the stay-at-home effect, or if they're just driving more, because either people are taking public transit less and they're driving more, or they're taking public transit less and just going less places in general. I think it's the latter. I think people are choosing to stay home more just because we are being told to by our governments. And if you're not, you really should be. But that's just something to consider. So I think the reduction in emissions related to transportation is such a huge step, because if you look at our world, we are connected through travel. We are connected through transit. Most people have to commute pretty far for their daily lives to get to work. For instance, in Toronto, the average commute time is 34 minutes, and 17% of commuters report traveling over 60 minutes each way in order to get to work. And that's insane. So Toronto has the longest commute time on average out of the country, but other cities also have really high commuting times as well, like Vancouver, whose commute time is 30 minutes, Calgary, whose average is 27 minutes, Montreal, also 30 minutes, and the lowest apparently is Regina, where it's 18 minutes. But in general, the national average is a 26-minute commute, give or take. So the fact that people are not going to work anymore, cutting down their emissions, cutting down the amount of time they're driving, we're putting less emissions in the air, less carbon dioxide, less nitrous oxides. And we are seeing a shift in air quality. We are seeing a shift in the ozone. And what this may mean for our future, depending on how long these effects last, and I'll talk about that more later, but depending on how long these effects last, it might be a huge step towards our overall emissions reduction goal that we have set for the year 2030 to get us under that 2-degree warming benchmark. And on top of individual cars being on the road less, which I've also noticed just from walking down the street or just being a pedestrian, there are so many less cars on the road. It's crazy. But you also have to think about the fact that because schools are closed, there's no school buses, there's no carpooling to and from school. There are so many less flights because travel is being restricted, borders are being shut, cruise ships are docked, they're not going anywhere. All these forms of travel that are really emissions heavy are non-existent or reduced so much. So this is a huge step. But again, it will really depend on how long these effects last beyond COVID-19. So we'll talk about that more later. The next positive or perceived positive that has been in the news that I've seen is improving water quality, specifically in Venice, Italy. So I have personally been to Venice when I was younger. And if you've been to Venice or you've seen photos of Venice, you know the water in the Grand Canal, which is the canal that runs through the city. You see the gondolas on it, you see boats on it. You know that water is disgusting. Like, I'm sorry if you're from Venice, but it smells, it's this weird, murky, greenish blue color. It doesn't look good. You don't want to swim in it. But there's been photos and reports coming out showing how the water has cleared. You can see the bottom of the canal, because there's no boats, there's no gondolas, there's no tourists, there's no pollution being put in, and so the water is crystal clear. So I wanted to look into this just to make sure I wasn't promoting any myths or I wasn't saying anything that was false. What science is saying is that it's not actually the water quality that's improving. What we're seeing is because there's way less travel on the water, the sediments that are usually stirred up by motors on boats or just any interaction or any disturbance in the water, all those sediments are now settling on the base of the canal instead of being stirred up, which makes the water murkier. Regardless, though, there are beliefs that air quality is improving there, and because things are less murky, it might be improving the habitat quality for fish or for other species that are living in those aquatic systems. There's less pollution because there's less tourists there, there's less litter, so that is definitely helping the water in a sense. But the idea that the water clearing up directly correlates to water quality improving is just a myth. So I just wanted to clarify that. Nonetheless, it's still great to see because I don't think I've ever heard of the water there being clear, ever. So that's something. The third thing I wanted to touch on as a positive is the benefits to wildlife right now. So unfortunately, there are a lot of road mortalities with wildlife, things like turtles, salamanders, whose habitats tend to be fragmented by roads. So in order to get from one part of their habitat to the other, they need to cross the roads, especially salamanders, who it's in their genetic programming, if you will, that they need to get to certain ponds in order to breed at certain times per year. So they will go to these ponds. And if these ponds are on the other side of the road, they will cross it. Like, they don't care. They don't know what a road is. They're just going to cross it because their brain is telling them, you need to get to this pond. So these species cross the road, they get smushed by cars. The more cars are on the road, the higher the risk, especially because things like salamanders and turtles are kind of slow. And there's also insects, birds, other things that end up on the road, larger animals like bears, wolves, moose, things like that. But because we're seeing less cars on the road now, it's probably, I haven't found a study that confirms this just because this is such a recent issue, but we can expect that road mortalities will decrease, especially for species like turtles and like salamanders, that there are many at-risk species here in Ontario, around the country, around the world, honestly. So if this is a way to help these populations that are at risk, and just other populations that aren't at risk yet, if this is a way to help them thrive and help them build their population numbers up again, that's a great plus. And that's honestly a little heartwarming thing to hear, that the little salamanders can get across the road and they can go find their mates and they can go have fun. So that's a nice thing to think about. So I touched on 3 positives to the environment because of COVID-19. So we looked at air quality, greenhouse gas emissions reductions, we looked at water quality or potential water quality, and we looked at wildlife benefits. But now I would like to focus on some negatives or some potential negatives that could take place because of the way society is behaving right now. The first thing I want to touch on is energy use. So while we may not be driving as much anymore, we may not be working in offices, we may just be going to less places less frequently, we are using quite a bit of energy, especially if we're staying at home. Especially if we're watching the news or we are talking on the phone. Think about if you're watching the news all day, think about how much energy your TV is sucking up. And if you're on the phone all day, think about how much energy that is that you're using. Or if you're in your house all day and you're leaving the lights on, like, that's a lot of energy being used within your household. And if everyone is staying at home in their individual households with their individual lighting and their individual TVs and all this is a lot of energy being used. And to make energy, you need resources. We tend to need fossil fuels. Here in Ontario, we are very reliant on hydropower and nuclear power, which is great. But there are many parts of the world that are still very fossil fuel heavy, even within Canada. So that is something to consider because our energy usage is likely going up at the individual level, even if on the larger corporate business level, it's reducing because we're simply not using buildings like offices. Second thing I want to touch on is waste. So as part of the sanitary measures, the precaution, we are using a lot of single-use products that we wouldn't have been using before, or we have been cutting down our usage of, which this part has been really heartbreaking for me because I've seen the steps our society has taken to become not zero waste, but reduce our waste or to be more mindful consumers in recent years. And it's been great, but we've kind of taken a step back. And I think, of course, it's necessary to try and be as sanitary as possible and mitigate the spread of this virus as much as possible. But think about the implications, the long-term implications of this waste. So when I talk about single-use products, I'm talking about face masks that doctors or that individuals are using, especially if you change them once a day, twice a day, many times a day. I'm talking about medical gloves. I'm talking about plastic bags. There's a grocery store in my local area where they're no longer taking reusable bags in fear of transmitting any virus or any essence of the virus if someone who owns that reusable bag has come in contact with it. cafes are only letting to-go cups be used, or they're only allowing takeout, and so we have to use things like styrofoam containers or these fake compostable containers, which I've touched on in another post, and don't even get me started on those. Not to mention hoarding things that we don't necessarily need or we don't need in such large amounts. Of course, I'm talking about toilet paper. I've gone to the store, and as a college student with limited funds, I live in a communal apartment, but I buy my own toilet paper. I don't go out that much. I don't need a lot, but I do need rolls. And so when I only had 3 rolls left, I was like, okay, I need to go out and get toilet paper. And I went to the store, and I went there as soon as it opened, and there were people flocking to the new stock of toilet paper, buying 20, 30, 40, 50 rolls of toilet paper. And I was like, all I want are a few extra rolls so I don't run out before I go home. That's all. And I can't even do that. And there were some poor elderly people beside me who also didn't get any toilet paper because people are hoarding this, because the media is pushing this. We might go into lockdown. We might go under quarantine. We need all of this. I think people are getting lost in that hype, and so they're feeding off of one another, and you see someone hoarding all this toilet paper, so you're like, well, I have to buy all this because, look, the store's running out, so what if it runs out? So you just buy and buy and buy. And some people, like college students, like the elderly, like the disabled, don't even have the opportunity to stock up on the necessary amounts. And don't forget about all the waste that comes with that, like all the packaging, all the toilet paper rolls themselves, all this waste that comes from that. The challenge with a lot of these single-use products is that they are either packaged or they themselves are garbage. They're not recyclable, they're not compostable, and so they are going to end up in our landfills. And I don't even want to imagine how many hand sanitizer bottles, how many masks, or how much toilet paper packaging is going to end up in our landfills after this is all over. That stuff isn't going to break down for thousands of years. I wrote a blog post about the life of a plastic water bottle, or just talking about plastic in general and how it breaks down. If you want to check that out, I will link that in the show notes. But it just shows that plastics can take hundreds to thousands of years to break down in landfills. So our landfills are going to fill up, and they're going to fill up fast, and we don't have unlimited space for this plastic. So that's something to be concerned about. Also, don't forget the resources and the energy that had to go into making those single-use products, and the fact that we're running out so rapidly means we have to use so many more resources and so much more energy to keep producing. I walked into a Bath and Body store to buy a hand sanitizer because I was running out, and I walked in, and this was over a week ago. This was actually probably 2 weeks ago, before it really got big in Canada. I think Canada had less than 80 cases of COVID-19 at this point, but I walked into my local mall, I walked into this body store, and I went to buy hand sanitizer, and they said, we had thousands shipped in yesterday, and they're all sold out. And that just blew my mind. So imagine how much waste, how much energy, and how much resources are going into that, and how long that's going to stay in our landfills. Again, I understand the precautions, I understand the sanitary needs for this, but it's just something to think about. The next thing I wanted to talk about, which is related to the last point, is food waste. So on top of hoarding products like toilet paper and other single-use products, we are seeing people hoarding food, which I guess I can understand things like canned beans, other canned products, non-perishable foods, yes. But hoarding perishable foods, and when I say hoarding, I just mean taking a lot in comparison to what you would usually buy. So taking perishable foods that are going to go bad within a few days is just not logical. Why would you go to Costco and buy 10 pounds of meat that is going to expire in 2 to 3 days when you're a family of 3 or 4 and you don't even eat meat that much? It's a waste of your money. It's a waste of resources for people who might need that meat, and it's a waste of food. It's going to end up in the garbage, and it's really sad when we have these food waste challenges and we have these food distribution challenges in the world. I've talked about this in a blog post before, specifically the challenges with our global food system, and the myth that we don't have enough food to feed the growing population in the world. It's not a matter of lack of food, not enough food. It's a matter of our global food system does not distribute that food equally. So we have developed nations where most of our emissions are coming from, most of our waste is coming from. We have all the food concentrated in these areas, and then less developed, poorer countries who aren't emitting as much, who don't have access to resources, to funding, are not receiving the nutrition that they need. So when the people who are fortunate enough are hoarding all this food that is going to be wasted, it impacts everybody. There's less food for everybody, and it just amplifies these existing problems within our global food system. That said, there are some initiatives going on to reduce food waste that I've noticed, which are positive. For instance, my university, as a result of it closing last week, or over a week ago now, in terms of classes, and then last week actually shutting down majority of their services, including cafeterias. The food that was left over in these cafeterias was donated to a local food bank, which is amazing because that would have been hundreds of pounds of food, hundreds of liters of fluids, and other products that would have gone to waste because of this rapid change and rapid shutdown, but instead it's going to people who really need it in these chaotic times in our community. So those are the downsides to the current COVID-19 crisis that I see. There's probably others, but these are the specific ones that stand out to me. So again, we have impacts on energy usage. We're seeing a lot more energy usage within our individual households, a lot of waste associated with single-use products and what that will mean for our landfills and the future of our waste. And we're seeing a lot of food waste, which is amplifying issues within our existing global food system and social inequity issues. So when you look at all these things, when you look at the positives like wildlife protection, like enhancing water quality, enhancing air quality, emissions reductions, compared to things like waste, energy use, it's tricky to say whether coronavirus is good or bad for the environment. I think it's very clear that there are positives as well as negatives to this epidemic, to this pandemic for that matter. But what I think is more important than labeling it as good for the environment or bad for the environment is just how it demonstrates how quickly our society is able to make changes. So one of the challenges with the global emission reduction targets that have been made, or rather the global agreement under the Paris Agreement, disclaimer with that though, individual nations had to sign onto that and they had to agree to specific targets. So every country has its own target aiming to reduce their emissions so that the overall global temperatures don't rise above this 2-degree mark. But that said, one of the biggest challenges that nations across the world seem to be facing in reaching their individual targets is that they don't think it's enough time. Because with climate change, the effects we're seeing now are lagged. So the effects we're seeing of climate change now, like extreme weather, like global warming, these are a result of actions taken decades ago. So we're looking at even 30, 40, 50 years ago when urban sprawl really began, when industrialization really picked up, when the world globalized more and more and we became a very capitalist society. So these are issues that are prolonged. And so we're worried, how can we make a change so quickly? What coronavirus shows is that when we see the relevance or we feel the threat to our daily lives, we can take action. Look at how quickly emissions have reduced in places like China, in Italy, and around the world as people travel less. If we continue these efforts, we will meet, maybe not every country will meet its goals, but we will be very close to meeting our emission reduction goals by 2030, by 2050, by 2100. We can make these changes. This just shows that it is possible. It's not so hard like we thought. But the fact is, it took a threat from something like a global pandemic that has impacted nearly every single country in the world, threatening the economy, threatening our healthcare, threatening our well-being, our ability to connect with others in order for us to realize this. And then the other side to that is once this is all over, when we can start going out again, when we can start talking to people face to face and not being worried about spreading a virus, how will these effects change? Will we be more aware, and will we continue our emissions reductions or improving air quality, water quality, things like that? Or will we go back to our previous ways? Personally, I think that, and as positive as I am, I know it's impossible for emissions not to rise again because the global economy is going to resume its its previous practices. Things are going to pick up, and they're probably going to pick up heavier than they were before to make up for that lost time. So saying that these targets, these current reductions will continue is a very optimistic look on things. Another thing that this shows is that we can function as a society without traveling as much as we usually do. We can work from home, we can Skype in on meetings, we can take days off and still be productive. And those promote not just sustainability in terms of reducing emissions, so not just environmental sustainability, but social sustainability, because we overall feel better when we have that time. We feel more comfortable at home. We can interact with our loved ones more. We can sleep more. We can take time for ourselves while still being productive. I think that's another thing that's really clear in this current situation. I've been more productive than I've ever been in, well, not ever been, but in a very long time, having extra time to sleep, extra time to take care of myself, things that I can't usually do while I'm in university, while I'm attending classes. I'm not saying that I don't like being in classes, because I love being in lectures. I love learning much more than online courses, but it shows that having that extra time for yourself and to be with the ones you care about does make a difference. So will we be able to continue those habits in the future? Will we be able to shift our ways of thinking, our worldviews around what a productive society looks like? Only time will tell. Another thing I want to touch on related to how environmental initiatives are going to shift is right now, environmental initiatives are taking a backseat to COVID-19. Understandably so, because the world's health is at risk. But that doesn't mean we need to sacrifice these environmental initiatives, nor can we forget that climate change is a real issue, because when this is all over, climate change will still be there. And if we're not taking actions to mitigate it still, it's going to get worse, even if emissions are reducing right now. For instance, in the news, there was an article in the past week or so that the Czech Republic's premier said that they should ditch the green law that promotes carbon neutrality within the European Union so that they can better focus on fighting coronavirus. If I'm putting my opinion out there, that's crazy. Please do not ditch it. The European Union has been a leader in many senses, in many ways, for environmental sustainability, for climate action. So trashing this agreement, we don't know if it's going to come back if they trash it. We don't know if the momentum will still be there. So discarding that shows the world that climate change is not important. And climate change arguably has been connected to coronavirus's spread in some ways. So discarding this is not something that we can afford to do for our future, because like I said, when coronavirus is over, climate change will still be there, and we cannot afford to sacrifice our efforts, especially from climate action leaders, to fight this. We definitely need to keep fighting it, but we need to find some sort of balance there. So all of this to say, what are the next steps? What is Canada going to do? What is North America going to do? What is the world going to do? We've seen the good and the bad for the environment in relation to COVID-19. We've chatted about what the future could look like. We've talked about what are the shifting perspectives that are necessary to promote sustainability in the future, what could threaten our future sustainability. All that to say, what does it come down to as an individual person? How can you try to be mindful in this time of the environment? I wrote a post in this past week about how you can live sustainably in times of coronavirus, in times of social isolation. So I will link that in the show notes because that shows that how you can live sustainably during this intense time. But on the grander scale, we just can't forget about these issues that are ongoing in the world that won't disappear when corona disappears and will likely be amplified. I also just wanted to point out how coronavirus shows how interconnected systems are in the world. So it's not just a health pandemic, it's an environmental pandemic because we are seeing this waste problem, we are seeing this energy problem, we are seeing problems with our global food system and how shelves in supermarkets are running out and how we can't get food delivered fast enough. And if we have to close borders, what will that mean for our food security? We are seeing social inequity be amplified as this food runs out because those who need it the most, like elderly and disabled, don't have access to that food. And what does coronavirus mean for homeless people? What does it mean for First Nations, for the Indigenous peoples who don't have access to the healthcare, to the services they need to protect themselves in order to overcome this because of the social inequity that exists within our society? This has been a lot in this podcast, but I hope it's given you a new perspective about coronavirus and it shows you how interconnected issues are. It's not just health, it's also social, environmental, economic, political. There are so many dimensions to the coronavirus pandemic. I hope you have a better understanding of the environmental side of it now. I hope you know what you can do to promote sustainability in your life. I hope you all have a great day, as great as it can be. Remember to take care of yourselves, be mindful of your behaviors, be mindful of your environmental impact, do what you can, and just find the calm. It's so important right now. Connect with loved ones, be grateful, reflect, do all the things. Take care of yourself. Have an amazing day. Until next time.